After a high-stakes night in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney's minority government survived its biggest test yet. The House of Commons passed Carney's first federal budget with a razor-thin vote that keeps Canadians from heading back to the polls this winter. Parliament came within just 2 votes of triggering a national election. The budget motion passed 170 to 168, securing the Liberals' hold onto power.
Budget vote. There are more votes, of course, to come through the budget process, but an important step for our country, protecting our communities, protecting our borders, protecting our way of life, building our country, building locally, building new trade infrastructure, building as an energy superpower, goes to your question. And Canada is blessed. We're blessed with immense natural resources, everything from hydroelectricity through to conventional oil and gas. We're part of an energy transition. We're going to help to lead it. That means Alberta, that means Quebec, that means Ontario, that means all of Canada, it means all forms of energy. And then last and most importantly, this is about empowering Canadians. It's about helping all Canadians get ahead.
I'm now joined in studio by political commentator Ashley Waters and our contributor David Clement to discuss the verdict. So Ashley, let's actually start with you. This was one of the closest confidence votes that we've seen in a very long time, with an extremely narrow result of 170 to 168. What do the results tell us about the Carney government and where they're at right now? Would you say they're united, or is this a sign that maybe something's not working?
Well, as you said, it was razor thin. And working with a minority government, we don't have the coalitions going into it that they once did with the NDP. And because the political landscape that we're working with right now, coming from the election last April, coming into winter season, nobody wants a federal election. So with all these different variables, I think it was a bigger conversation about who they could have cross aisle, who they could find some trust with. But I think it's interesting that ahead of time there wasn't that pre-consultation with certain MPs like they would before to try to tailor the budget so that way they would vote in favor of it. So out of everything, I think that was most interesting to see, days leading up to the vote of who they would bring on board. And we saw that especially with the Green Party.
Right. And David, from your perspective, would you say that this was a sign of political strategy, or was this just luck from the Liberals?
So I agree with Ashley that Canadians generally didn't want an election, but the only group who would have stood to gain from sending Canadians back to the polls would have been the Liberals. And so it was, in my view, a way of creating a scenario where, yes, it was razor thin, but if the opposition parties were really going to dig in their heels, they were particularly well suited to go into an election again. That primarily is just the dynamics of Canada and the non-existence of the NDP, which we've talked about many times. With the NDP in its current state, without a leader, without finishing that leadership contest, it's very likely that several of those seats that they currently hold, the few seats that they do hold, could or would have gone to the Liberals, potentially giving Mark Carney his majority government. So I'm sure we'll get into this. It felt very much like a show was being put on by all parties in terms of the jockeying over, are we going to support it, are we not? And I think it was a foregone conclusion that as much as the opposition parties wanted to portray that they were voting against the budget, at the end of the day, we were never going to be in a scenario where we were actually going to get an election, because I think they also knew that the only party who would have benefited from that would have been the Liberals.
So you think that this was more political theater than it was actually arguing? Ashley, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And we saw that even for the last minute votes with, the House leader and the House whip. They were physically there in that building and they were going to use, the app in order to vote. And so there's technical difficulties. But so it was very last second for them to run in and be in person to do the voting. And again, just to David's credit, is that jockeying of, do we have enough votes that we won't have to worry about this? And nobody wants to be the cause of spurring an election.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge factor, is that then becomes the election narrative.
Right.
And if you're a Liberal Party strategist, that is an absolute gift to say, we're going into the holiday season, you're going to have to go to the polls, and it's their fault that you're going to the polls. Vote for us, punish them. They would have only needed a few more seats to get over the line in terms of a majority. So yeah, it very much felt like political theater to keep up appearances rather than a serious instance where potentially confidence was going to fall.
And it's interesting that you say that because after changing her mind from a few weeks ago, Green Party leader Elizabeth May turned around last night and actually said that she was going to support the budget. And here is what she said as to why she was going to change her vote.
I heard overwhelmingly from my constituents and Canadians from coast to coast that they wanted someone to stop an election happening by accident. That's a place of responsibility. And I heard my own inner voice say, we're at the very edge of it being too late for us to be sure that our own children and grandchildren alive today can live in a livable world where human civilization is sustainable. Without what I heard from the Prime Minister today, I would have voted no. I didn't like the idea of ducking and abstaining, although that was a possibility. I wasn't afraid of an election for me personally, for the Green Party. But the answer is, I heard a firm commitment to something I hadn't heard before from Mark Carney, Prime Minister, that I'd heard previously from Mark Carney, former Governor of the Bank of Canada, former Governor of the Bank of England, former Special Envoy for Climate Finance to the Secretary General of the United Nations. I heard a firm commitment we will meet our Paris targets. That requires action very soon because the first target we're going to hit is 2030 and then 2035. Legally binding treaty commitments and a commitment to do far more that we've heard in the budget with funding for the Kunming Montreal commitments to nature, to stop beating up on Mother Earth and start the process of CPR.
Now, Ashley, as we saw just there, Elizabeth May ultimately flipped her vote to support the budget. What do you think pushed her to change her mind, and how significant was that decision?
Going back to the Paris Agreement and trying to hit those targets. Listen, she's the party leader, right? And it's the Green Party. If they're not trying to back up climate change, if they're not trying to make their voice heard, that really weakens her position.
Right.
So again, with the dramatics, again, with it was because of my constituency, it was all the right reasons. She can say that she wasn't worried about an election, but ultimately most of them were. So, and for her to say that there was a promise from Mark Carney, it wasn't a commitment. It was saying we'll try to meet that goal. And as we know by the dates, it is till 2030. So we can say we're working towards something. But I thought the other interesting piece was that she was saying she wouldn't give him another confidence vote.
Right.
So it wasn't necessarily a given just because she was doing it this time. So again, it's that mixed message of not wanting to trigger the election. She's saying that didn't scare her at all, which, okay, if she wants to say that on TV and that's the soundbite of the day. But at the same time, it really comes down to how much leverage did they have? And I think it is really significant that she did vote in favor because it gave them that cross the finish line, right, in opposition.
Well, May also did mention that she didn't want the election to fall on her, and she had actually said it earlier in the clip. But do you think that the onus would have fallen on May if she had chosen not to vote in favor of the budget?
I mean, it could have. And that could have been a strategy to blame the Greens. But then again, at the same time, the Green Party isn't the force in Canadian politics that it once was. I think really it's more about political survival for the party, although they're not necessarily in the same shambles as the NDP. The path for the Green Party to gain more seats, I mean, they've been around for a long time. They have won. The prospects in Fredericton, where they previously had one, are gone. Kitchener in Ontario or Guelph maybe gone. So going into another election to potentially just hold on to Elizabeth May's seat isn't a particularly attractive option if you're a Green Party supporter or Elizabeth May herself.
Now, for May to say that she wasn't afraid of an election, and if it happened, it wouldn't have mattered, why would she have highlighted that she had constituents that had said that they didn't want an election if to her it didn't really matter?
It's that double speak. And I think a lot of people are tired of that when it comes to listening to politicians. And so really, if she wants to say, I don't mind, we had candidates already set up in each one of the ridings, God bless her. At the same time, when you come to the reality of knowing that she did have to speak up when it came to climate change, she did have to speak up when it came to emissions. I thought it was interesting that she wanted them to keep the carbon tax, and she was saying how important that's going to be for the industrial carbon tax. So without getting too much into the weeds on, carbon pricing, there's still that necessary cap that will be there if we want to hit those Paris agreements.
Now, we do have to go to break, but when we come back, we'll hear from the NDP leader and Pierre Poilievre and see what actually happened with the vote last night. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Now, before the break, I was joined by David Clement and Ashley Waters, and we were discussing the role that Elizabeth May played in the federal budget passing the first vote. Now, interim NDP leader Don Davies told reporters after the vote that his party could not support the government's budget. Davies criticized the government, saying that the Liberals showed no willingness to adjust the budget to address NDP concerns or win the party's support. Here's what he had to say.
Up to Budget 2025, New Democrats made it very clear that it needs to address head-on the crises facing Canadian families and invest in the programs that Canadians rely on. We have record unemployment, particularly among young people. We have a housing shortage and a cost of living crisis in communities across the country. Our cherished public health care system needs to be expanded, not cut. We need better childcare. Since the budget was presented almost 2 weeks ago, we have taken the time to listen to our constituents and to meet with stakeholders. It is clear from those conversations that this is a budget that does not address the real needs facing Canadians. It fails to meet the moment, deliver transformational change, or address the urgent needs facing Canadians. While there are elements of the budget which reflect our concerns, on the whole, this is a conservative budget. From reducing healthcare funding to provinces, to making deeper cuts to services than Stephen Harper's budgets did, including to programs that are helping Canada's most marginalized communities, to reversing action on the climate crisis, this budget fails to deliver the policies our country needs.
Now, David, let's talk about the NDP. Don Davies said that his party couldn't support the budget, yet 2 NDP MPs abstained, effectively helping it pass. Now, what does that say about the internal unity within the NDP?
Well, I think that there's a divide between those who are running for party leadership. If you look at Heather McPherson, she was far more straightforward in terms of I'm voting no, and here's why. And those who don't have leadership aspirations. But then at the same time, I mean, Don Davies has gotten into it on Twitter lately about the financial status of the party, more than $20 million in debt. Could they afford to go into another election? The answer to that is no, they couldn't. They have to get through their leadership process and inject some life back into the party in order to be even remotely significant. And I find it interesting that he's referred to this as a conservative budget, in other instances as an austerity budget. I'm hard pressed to see how more than $70 billion in debt, the second highest in Canadian history, is austerity by any measure. But I ultimately think that this just comes down to, for their own survival, they could not afford to go into an election. And so you have those who, like MP Downs, who doesn't have leadership aspirations per se, who abstain, who get this over the finish line.
Now, Ashley, Davies accused the Liberals of refusing to compromise. Is this a sign that the NDP has lost its leverage, or a broader strategy heading into the next session of Parliament?
I think they're just trying to distance themselves as much as they can. So as much as the Liberals might want to distance themselves from the NDP just because of the supply and confidence agreement that is no longer, I think that they're playing into that as well by saying, here, this is a conservative budget, trying to bring it back to this isn't actually for social programs and we're missing all these things. However, childcare is still in there, the dental program's still in there. There are certain social programs that kept within the budget. So I think as far as grandstanding, Don Davies has to come out that way. He has to come out swinging, saying, we're for the people and we're for the programs, and
Right.
we're not seeing that from this Liberal government, because he needs to be able to have some kind of distinction between, the left and the center at this point.
Right. And David, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think basically don't draw a line in the sand. Well, there's no one to captain the ship. Create enough distance between the two parties as best you can to give yourself the wiggle room for when they do have a new leader to define what it is it means to be the new Democrats moving forward. And so you buy yourself that time to have that process be drawn out. And then the party has to figure out what direction it's going to go and how it's going to differentiate from the Liberals and the Conservatives whenever we do have another election.
Now, since the budget was released, Pierre Poilievre, of course, was very against what the Liberal government have put on the table. And here's what he had to say yesterday while debating with Mark Carney.
Prime Minister's costly deficit gambles our future on the national credit card, and it drives up food, housing, and tax bills. In fact, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has revealed in his recent report the Prime Minister has doubled Justin Trudeau's deficit. He's brought in the biggest deficit in Canadian history outside of the pandemic, $16 billion bigger than he promised only 7 months ago. Why is it the Prime Minister breaking his word and forcing Canadians to pay higher inflation today and higher taxes tomorrow for his costly credit card budget?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, today is a good day. Inflation is down 2.2%. It's for almost 2 years. It's running within the Bank of Canada's target. Mr. Speaker, today this is a good month. Unemployment is down again. Jobs are up again. Mr. Speaker, today is a historic day. The Leader of the Opposition and his colleagues have an opportunity to vote for generational investment to build.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Maybe it's a good day for him and his Brookfield buddies who are dodging their tax bills, but it's a terrible day for the Canadian people stuck paying record-high grocery bills. In fact, the Prime Minister said he'd be judged by prices at the grocery store. Today, Statistics Canada revealed that grocery price inflation is almost double the Bank of Canada's target, rising 40% faster in Canada than in the United States of America. The direct result of the Liberal industrial carbon tax on farmers, the food packaging tax, the fuel standard tax. The Prime Minister puts his budget on the national credit card. Does he expect Canadians to pay their groceries the same way?
Now, David, earlier we heard Don Davies say that this budget looks a lot like a Conservative one. And a lot of people have given that criticism. Ashley and I actually spoke about that. But why do you think that Poilievre is so against the federal budget when people are saying that it's quite conservative and comparing it to something that Stephen Harper would have put out?
I think that comparing it to something Stephen Harper would put out is a gross misunderstanding of the Harper era. I don't think that this budget is particularly conservative. I mean, incrementally, if you compare it to the Trudeau era, yes, it is marginally more towards the middle than Trudeau, but from a conservative perspective, that bar is so low that it's not hard to do. It's not hard to tinker at the margins to be incrementally more towards the center. But I think the framing of this as a conservative budget is false. I mean, the only comparison, which I would assume that maybe someone who's a Liberal supporter or NDP supporter could point out, would be the Harper budget during the global financial crisis. But even then, that's a hard stretch or hard comparison to make for me.
And do you think that there is anything that Carney could have put on the budget that Poilievre would have been happy with? Or do you think it's his job to be the opposition?
It's his job to be the opposition. And going into a leadership review in January, there's so much at stake there for him. And especially because there was floor crossers, and because they have so many other elements that were thrown in, is that really brought the drama into the
Right.
Conservative Party when it came to this budget, and really trying to get the house in order where there wasn't going to be any more floor crossings. And I think that's why it stood it up for like a liberal leaning or an NDP to say this is more in line with a conservative government because of the cuts with civil servants and things like that you wouldn't have saw if it was a Trudeau budget previous to this. So there's such a mix within this budget that it's really hard to pinpoint how it helps that average Canadian family right now with the stressors of, housing, food, the economy that way. But they need to be able to say that they're setting us up for success, for sustainability when it comes to our sovereignty because of what we're dealing with the US. So there's so many elements when it comes to this budget and what we're going to see with the next confidence votes.
Well, and I want to talk about the Conservative Party a little bit more as a whole, because Pierre Poilievre has been getting a lot of backlash because there were floor crossers. Do you think that Poilievre should take a look in the mirror and maybe change his leadership style a little bit? Or do you think come January, he's going to be doing fine?
I think he'll survive the leadership vote, but what I would have done is would have highlighted what is not in the budget. So there's nothing really to invite investment in response to US tax cuts. There's nothing to reform the healthcare system to bring us more in line with Europe in terms of how care is delivered. They spend less and have better outcomes. There's nothing in terms of changes for citizenship. There's no pressure on cities to change their zoning rules to increase building, to solve the housing crisis. But there's Eurovision, and we can maybe feel good about that, even though the CBC already, when they studied it, said it was cost prohibitive. That would be my approach if I was Pierre Poilievre.
Well, David and Ashley, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.